I'm Telly Mahoney, and welcome back to The Good Room. Today, we're thinking about what makes a good gallery room with Larry Speck, a page design director who worked on the UMLAUF and the Big Bend Museum, which are both located in Texas. Joining Larry is Mark Wagner, who is a project director at Davis Brody Bond, which is a page company. Mark worked on the Frick Collection and the 9/11 Museum and Memorial, which are both in New York City. So to kick off our conversation, Mark, could you please tell me some about your experience when it comes to designing gallery rooms?
I think the first thing for an architect thinking about a museum is not just the one room, it's how that one room is going to fit into an overall experience. And a lot of our experience here on the projects that we've engaged in out of the New York office, fortunately, we've been able to start in the master planning phase to really understand what the museum's needs are and what kind of a space and what kind of an audience they have. And you almost start on that big scale, and then you fine tune down that experience for maybe sometimes as fine as one individual piece of artwork, but it really starts on a bigger scale.
My experience is complementary to Mark's, I think, because it has been much more about quirky little museums that have a very, very specific mission and a very odd character that they're trying to accommodate. And they really are not so much about a general way to deal with displaying things, but they've got these specific objects that they're trying to give an atmosphere and a character to a space that would support those quirky, odd objects that they're dealing with. So one example would be we did the UMLAUF sculpture garden years ago, and then we just recently done the design for a new extension of it. And it's just one artist's work, Charles UMLAUF. They do have changing exhibits of other sculpture, but it's all about sculpture, not 2D work. And it's all about connection to the garden and to outdoor space, which of course in most museums you're, ultraviolet light. But this is all about a kind of connection between these works of art and nature. The bulk of what they show is UMLAUF's work, and they have his house and his studio. So you can really see the whole artist's world and their work pattern and how they worked with their family. And I mean, it just is a very personal, very intimate connection to the making of art and then the display of art and the connection of art to the landscape. All of those things that shape the whole place.
Sculpture is an interesting thing, though, right? Because sculpture you experience on so many different levels, right? It's seeing a sculpture across, in this case, in an exterior setting, seeing a sculpture maybe across on the other side of a garden or a field. So the scale changes as you approach it, and then it's the finer details when you get to it. So thinking about that exterior space as the gallery, how do you curate an experience in an open setting where a visitor will experience the art on multiple levels, right? And at the 9/11 Museum, we had to deal with things similar to this in very large scale artifacts, remnants from the debris pile from 9/11, where you have a 45-foot tall column that you want to see part of that from a distance. And it's not until you really approach the column that you see the inscriptions and, the notes left on the surface of the column. So it's a very different type of experience, different scales of an experience, and different levels of intimacy to that.
Absolutely. And I think also lighting is so different in that case. I know 2D works, they really want that lighting perfect and controlled and just highlighting that surface exactly right. But in a three-dimensional sculptural setting, for one thing, like you say, you see it from many different vantage points, and it's going to have different light from different locations. In the case of having a connection to outdoors, you've got to deal with a lot of natural light as well as artificial light. So I think sculpture and objects are a completely different kind of gallery and room and experience than 2D.
Yeah, the Portico Gallery at the Frick Collection is one of these unique experiences, too. It was a new addition to the museum, very small gallery in square footage. It was under 800 square feet of newfound space. It was an exterior portico facing the Fifth Avenue Garden. southern facing, bright sunlight. The idea of allowing visitors to experience that portico just as an experience of stepping out into that space and experiencing the garden in a new way was the first step. Then determining what kind of a collection could be safely put and displayed in a space like that. It wasn't going to be fine art, right? With the UV lights, as Larry, you made the face before about UV light and art. They really aren't friends. The best way to protect a piece of art is to keep it in a dark room forever, right? So what kind of a collection can exist in a brightly daylit space? And that came down to porcelains. A collection was in the negotiation phase of being donated to the Frick at the time. And that just seemed to be the perfect fit for that kind of space. As you're in the portico gallery, you're stepping out of the mansion proper, you're coming out of the library into this portico space, shifting from very controlled light to bright daylight. That was a technical challenge for us. How do we make that a comfortable experience for the visitors? But we also wanted the visitors to then feel the repetition of the columns in the space, feel the architecture, and experience the art within that architecture.
And then changing gears a bit, but the UMLAUF, Big Ben, the Frick, and some other collections are modernizing it and preserving aspects. What are some challenges that you may have come across when you're thinking about preserving a space and keeping that original character?
I always actually love adding on to something that's already got a momentum of its own. I like to start from scratch, but I also really enjoy having a nudge from something that was there before. And so in both of those cases, the UMLAUF and the Museum of the Big Ben, there was a very strong existing character. And the challenge was to really not just extend that, but transform the whole institution. In both cases, that's what they wanted. That we don't want to just continue, but do more of what we've been doing. We want something transformational. We want something that's going to give us a whole new life and capability that we didn't have before.
And Larry, I saw that transformation really ended up benefiting the Big Ben Museum because soon after the expansion, USA Today created a list of the top 10 best small town museums, and the Big Ben ended up ranking #1. So congratulations. That's just truly a testament to the power of thinking in a new light and taking that step into a new journey with a transformation like that. And Mark, what about in your experience?
Well, I think there's actually kind of two sides to that question, maybe about adding to historic context. There's the technical aspect of it. How do you preserve the character of, and I'll put this in maybe the smallest context of the Frick collection and the largest context of the 9/11 Museum, both in New York here. The Frick collection was looking at this historic envelope, knowing that we had to incorporate modern technologies, lighting, life safety, mechanical distribution, and how do you do that in an envelope that's already there? And obviously, we're not going to start cutting away existing limestone for existing openings. How do you sensitively understand the needs of a space and then how to incorporate those systems, right? We actually had gone back in time a little bit and thought, what would Tom Hastings do, right? The original architect of the house. And what we kind of came to the conclusion that, looking at a lot of his projects, he was really pushing the envelope of materials at the time for, the turn of the century from 1900 through the 1930s. A lot of his projects were really looking at what was the latest technology that I could use. Would he have installed or would he have done things differently if he could get a larger pane of glass, an insulated pane of glass? Probably. Right. So when we start thinking about it in that kind of context, that opens up the door that we can bring in modern technologies, but how do we do it in a way that doesn't create too much of a contrast between the existing historic envelope and the new modern insertions? One, and I said I'm going to talk two prongs on this and how you maintain that existing experience, but bring in all the necessities of a modern museum. The other is looking at something like the 9/11 Museum, where the historic context of that was much more recent, but there was remnants of that history that actually told the story of memory and of authenticity and scale and emotion all sort of wrapped into this one project. There were certain attributes and certain parts of that site that were named historic remnants. So when we thought about the authenticity of those things, we didn't want to start stacking a lot of new materials that were too far in contrast. We wanted to really let the existing authentic materials be the experience. Thinking about my own personal experience, I was on site about a week after September 11th and was a private sector consultant specifically selecting artifacts from the debris pile for preservation, a collection that resulted in about 2,000 pieces. But my experience on site is probably very different than a museum visitor today. And in some ways, thinking about my procession into this authentic site, whether it was when it was full of debris or after when it was cleaned out, was always an emotional one. There was always a sense of immersion into a site from a busy streetscape down to a very quiet, at the time, lower level, 70 feet below the street, and all the while moving down a ramp into that space surrounded by authentic historic artifacts. And that was a real thing that we wanted to preserve in that design, that we wanted that feeling and that understanding. So the ramp that you proceed down, an armature, at some point we described it as this snake kind of working its way through the site, that visitors don't really recognize that they're on a ramp because you're always looking beyond the surface that you're on. We wanted some comfort to that ramp. So the material selection there, where the rest of the authentic envelope was hard, it was concrete, it was rough, it was steel, it was construction materials, but we wanted something comforting for the visitor to be on. So we chose wood, a very residential material. So in some ways, there's a sense of safety and familiarity with that material as you're walking through or moving into a very potentially difficult site emotionally.
It's truly remarkable to me that the design of the 9/11 Museum not only preserves the physical remnants of the building, but that it also aims to capture that emotional essence. And I think that's clear from every aspect of the design, from the overall architecture, the layout, the materials that were selected, and everything so on was so carefully thought out to evoke that deep emotional response. And changing gears a bit, but sticking with that preservation idea, I'm thinking about inclusivity and how many of these preservation projects are also incorporating more accessibility standards into the site. Could you tell me some of what that might look like at a museum or a gallery?
First, I'll say it's the right thing to do, right? Everybody can have the experience, so why would we exclude anybody by not thinking forward about just the simplest approach to this, a ramp to get in rather than stairs? But we're also hearing the term designing for neurodiversity quite a bit these days. It's becoming more of a popular thing, and that's really about creating an environment that really addresses people's experience in a space, not just from the ramp, but also through textures of materials, sounds in a space. So we're looking at designing spaces almost with a bigger picture attitude about inclusion. So I don't know, Larry, have you done any neurodiversity work yet? I mean, it's really a new thing.
Right. I'm actually totally into what neuroscience has been able to teach us about the way we perceive space and architecture. And a lot of what the more recent neuroscience work has taught us is that there's a huge part of our brain that is an unconscious brain. We're not consciously looking and thinking and perceiving, but it's incredibly active, and it's a huge part of our brain. And a whole lot of our perception and even our decision-making and our behavior is based on our experience that's going through our unconscious brain. And I think it makes you design things in a different way when you're thinking of it's not the conscious experience I'm really aiming at here. It's the unconscious experience.
And we're seeing that experience documented a little bit more through science these days, but this is what we do intuitively, right? When we think about space, and we don't always get it right, right? But when we think about space and the experience, if you think about walking into a cathedral, grand space, the lights dim, maybe there's music, maybe there's something going on, but you walk in and you immediately feel, and this is intentional, right? For cathedral design, you immediately feel small. You immediately quiet down, your attitude settles, your mood settles. Similar to museums, because I think there's a certain psychological weight that comes with that and an expectation of how you act at a museum versus how you act at a playground. It's an energy level that we've been designing.
Right. And I mean, you were talking about a kid's experience is completely different than an adult's experience. And their neurological development is completely different than an adult's neurological development. So how can we really be conscious of the way diverse groups and people from different cultures actually will experience it in a completely different way and mean something different to them? So I think that neurodiversity has a lot of rich possibilities. Then I totally agree with Mark about we've become so conscious of people with different levels of mobility and different levels of sight and audio capability that we've really got to think of everybody when we're designing things. And that maybe becomes especially challenging in outdoor environments like a sculpture garden, where that was one of the things the original design of the UMLAUF was not as conscious of. I mean, that was 35 years ago. We just weren't, there were no requirements for ADA, but now we're able to go back and put some of that in. And that was a seminal part of the design because we're in a very steep topography. And how do I get from point A to point B? And it's not as easy as just switchback ramps. It would completely wear out somebody in a wheelchair trying to negotiate the kind of topography changes we had on the site. So you have to start thinking of completely different ways of using the buildings and using the buildings with the natural topography and elevators. And when do you need it mechanical and when can you do it in a more analog way?
I've done quite a bit of studies in the last 5 years for the National Park Service on visitor centers and interpretive centers, which obviously, right now, the way the Parks Department is really viewing things, they're getting away from the more traditional visitor center, right? They don't want to build a building. Really, they want to get you out into the park. And so accessibility has been a big question, right? It's just more challenging to get a wheelchair down a gravel path. It doesn't work.
Right.
So how do you do this when as you mentioned, a project that has larger topographical shifts, larger elevation shifts? How do you get from point A to point B in a meaningful way? And in part, what we have been trying to do is create nodes along that experience so that it's not just a ramp and a landing and a ramp and a landing and so on, down the 30-foot slope or whatever you have to navigate. But there have to be moments of respite and for that experience. And at those moments of respite, those can also be interpretive, a gallery experience or a moment for that interpretation, whether that's opening up for views. So it definitely, drawing that line between point A and B now has many stops along the way, potentially. And how do you best take advantage of those stops?
I like that idea that the ramps are doing more than just serving as a walkway function by incorporating those node spaces. Are there other ways, perhaps within the indoor museum areas, that those spaces are becoming more multi-purpose?
I'm really interested in a lot of newer museums that integrate life with the museum. So museums now, they have a cafe, they have a restaurant, a food place. In a few of them, there's art in that space. And so you're sitting there and you're having your meal and you're enjoying this piece of art in a different way than if you're standing up and you're walking around. And I am intrigued by blurring the boundary between, this is all about just looking at art. And the whole idea of looking at art while I'm also having a conversation or looking at art while I'm taking a break, and which I think is the way art's always meant to be experienced.
Right. I mean, some museums are so formal that, I can't get my kids to go to those.
Right.
Because they know they're there in some way for a lesson. Right.
Right.
But when it is that experience, and this is particularly true in sculpture gardens, because you can do lots of things. You can pay attention to the art, you can pay attention to nature, you can pay attention to each other in a different way.
I love it also when there are lots of places to sit, not just that one little bench in the middle of the gallery where it's in high demand because everybody's tired of standing. And so, you're waiting for a moment where you could sit down. But why not have furniture, nice soft chairs and just another kind of environment where you could relax and maybe have a conversation and then look at the painting a different way, or just a little bit more about everyday life, and not so much like you say with your kids that, oh my God, I'm here to get a lesson. And that puts art too distant from ourselves and our lives.
Multi-purpose spaces are becoming increasingly more popular in the newer museums. In fact, most of the studies that I've done recently for expansions, that's generally top of the list for that multi-purpose space, whether that be for a gallery or for educational purposes. We recently completed and are still working with the Museum of Contemporary Art in North Miami. And that's a very small museum, but it's so community driven. Their main mission is about serving a community. So for them, high on their priority list was education spaces and that multi-purpose space. And then the multi-purpose space also serves for these events and fundraising and other things when you have a hall that can be rented out for special events. The trouble with those kind of spaces that I always have is that what do you do when you don't have an event there? You've got this big empty space. How do you use it? Really liked what you were saying a few minutes ago about how art can be displayed in a much more casual setting if the art allows it, right? If the museum can stomach having artwork and more comfortable seating around it where the artwork is always present, but it's part of a more intimate dialogue between people that may just be sitting there, whether they're having coffee or just having a conversation, regrouping with their family or their friends. How do you create a space and install art in a way that's safe for a diverse collection of events? That may be a dinner, that may be a cocktail party, that may be a wedding. We're seeing all these things sort of coming into museum life on the daily basis.
I think it's always been a kind of odd thing that for an opening, it seemed okay to have people having their cocktails in the gallery space. But then in the everyday operation of the museum, everything's separate. But at the Museum of the Big Bend, they do have in their event spaces, they have works of art. And they're maybe not their most precious works of art, but they're perfectly acceptable in that space. And again, it's that way of looking at it in other ways besides I'm standing here staring and studying that piece of art. I'm just looking at it at a moment's glance and seeing something I wouldn't have seen. Yeah. Your mind works in a way that, sometimes those associations happen in a serendipitous way.
Yeah, it's kind of that idea of the gallery becoming a third space. So we have the home and work, and then that third space of where we have the community and the social interaction. This was a really exciting conversation. Thank you both so much for joining me.
Right. Thank you, Tolly.
So it was a lot of fun to talk about this stuff.